Today, 13th of October, is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. And it's a week, we've taken about 14 days carrying out different activities to mark the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, which has been set aside by the United Nations General Assembly to create awareness, to carry out sensitization in our country, in all countries in the world. It's a global celebration, and we have decided to start today's activity with a walk. This walk is going to help us to create awareness. It's a kind of sensitization that we are going to create in the capital city of Abuja. This is the federal capital of Nigeria, FCT, and we need people within this environment, within the community, within the entire city to know what disaster risk reduction is all about. And that is why we are going to carry out this work. We will have our officer who is going to talk to them, telling them the do's and don'ts in a situation where they'll be able to reduce disasters. And this year, the team tells us that fighting inequality for a resilient future. Fighting inequality in what sense? Fighting inequality in a way that will carry everybody along, from the grassroots to the aged, to the people living with disabilities. And that is why we have always worked in partnership with Christian Blind Mission and Sustainable Family Healthcare Foundation, who are having a project. They have carried out projects for the past 2 years, working along or carrying along people living with disabilities. And they are here with us to carry out this awareness so that whoever gets to know about it, we know that whatever disaster happens, that everybody should be carried along. Do not leave others behind, including religious leaders, people living with disabilities, children, women and girls, people that are bedridden, pregnant women, should be carried along. We have to show them that love. It has to do with total inclusiveness. And that is why we are going to carry out this work from here to the venue where we are going to have the final celebration of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction.
And the fight against inequality will take it easy. One step after the other. We are breaking the cycle of inequality. This is the FCT Emergency Management Agency, and it is the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. We're breaking the cycle of inequality when it comes to disaster risk reduction in the FCT. Our job is very simple: to reduce disaster risk for a safe and happy FCT. It's Mama F leading the team to mark this special days.
International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, a day set aside by the United Nations General Assembly since 1989 to encourage every citizen, all governments globally, to take part in building a more disaster resilient communities and nations. And this year's theme is fighting inequality for a resilient future. Hashtag break the cycle. I want to most sincerely at this junction thank the Honorable Minister of FCT, Minister of State, and especially the Permanent Secretary You heard it when the MC said from the beginning, there is no function right from the first day he assumed duty in the FCT administration. He has always stood by FEMA. He's always here with us. There's hardly a program that will organize that he will not come around to be with us. We really want to most sincerely appreciate him. Our former Director General, Dr. Abbas Garba Idris, the pioneer DG, who just resigned, I will say he has set up FEMA. He started FEMA and left it on a very footnote, planted good seed. We also want to thank him for coming. I understand he will join us shortly. We really appreciate him. The Executive Secretary of FCDA and the entire engineering department that are always standing by us. You will agree that each time we have any operations and we need our partners in the private sector, they are always there with us. Considering the theme for this year, I want to specially welcome the representative of Christian Blind Mission and Sustainable Family Health Care Foundation, because all through last year and this year, this is their second year, their main project is focused on people living with disabilities. And this year's theme is talking about inclusiveness, talking about fighting inequalities. Fighting inequalities in what sense? When a disaster strikes, when there's a disaster within your environment, how do you treat the vulnerables? How do you treat people living with disabilities? How do you treat the aged, people bedridden, women and children, pregnant women, especially the ones in labor within that period? And that is why we really want to appreciate the presence of CBM and Sustainable Family Healthcare Foundation for having this project already in 7 communities within the FCT. We thank you for coming especially, and thank you for giving us this sign language interpreter. We cannot thank you enough. From 2016, when Sendai Framework 7 Targets, 7 Years campaign started, FEMA has always celebrated the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, and we don't just keep it to one day. What we usually do is we make sure we take between 10 days to 14 days to mark this day, because it is a day that is set aside to create awareness, to carry out sensitization. And we make sure we go up to the grassroots, to take the message down to the grassroots, carrying all the communities along to make sure the message goes down. In previous years, we had different teams that focused their attention on home, safe home. We also had another one reducing displacement. Another one was focused on government. Another one on infrastructures. Another one on economic of each country. Another one is to support developing nations. But this year, you will agree with me that the United Nations General Assembly, given the importance of disaster risk reduction, which is also cost-effective and the equivalent of prevention is better than cure, now came up with this year's theme, which is a focus on we, the people that manage the environment. Human beings that live in a community, that makes up a community, human beings that will work on the disaster risk reduction, and that is why this year's theme has a great focus. And since it has to do with awareness, that was why we went round the 6 area councils, and we continue today to round up the program with all of you, our stakeholders, who have always played key roles in disaster risk reduction. Last year, we had early warning, early action. Action by who? Action by stakeholders, action by members of the community. And in creating this awareness, we try to make them understand that our first responders are considered to be members of that community. The immediate community where a disaster happens. How do we get to a disaster? They have to, first of all, identify the common hazards they have within their environment, because it is from the hazard that it escalates into a disaster. Once you are able to identify the hazards within your environment, is it flooding, building collapse, incident fire, outbreak, a tremor, outbreak of epidemic, road crashes, and many others. When you are able to identify them, you should be able to prevent them. And that is why we say prevention is better than cure. When you prevent it, if you cannot prevent it, you should think of how you will be able to mitigate it. And that was what we did these past 10 days, going around to create awareness within the different communities in the FCT. We were also on social media. We had TV and radio programs. Right now, we have our lines are open, and we are online. We have people who are going to view us online. And that is what this year's team is talking about: complete inclusiveness, fighting inequality. Nobody should be left out in disaster risk reduction.
Blind Mission International have been collaborating with FCT, Emergency Management Agency, and other disaster risk reduction actors in FCT. Since 2 years, we started a project we call Disability Inclusive Disaster Risk Reduction. This project focuses on ensuring that persons with disability have access to facilities, basic amenities, and also build resilience, especially where there is a disaster. As we all know that when disaster occurs, the most affected people are persons with disability. And that is why CBM, in line with the Sendai framework, have embarked on a project which we have been collaborating with the stakeholder FEMA to implement since 2 years ago.
I'm happy to be part of this year's celebration of International Day for Disaster Reduction that is put together by the FCT Emergency Management Agency. Let me start by congratulating the Director General, Management, and entire staff of the FCT Management Agency for recalling the special day to celebrate and create awareness on the need for reducing the risk that's associated with disaster, which has impacted negatively mostly on women, the poor, the physically challenged, and the most vulnerable group in the society. The Nigeria Hydrological Services Agency, NISA, appreciate and commend the FCT Emergency Management Agency for the pivotal role it is playing in the downstream sector. of the numerous disasters that are bedeviling our great nation, particularly in the FCT and its environs. The important role of humanitarian services and disaster risk management cannot be overemphasized, especially at this critical time in the history of the world, when mankind is faced by extreme natural disasters such as flood, earthquakes, tsunami, hurricanes, etc., which are further aggravated by climate change that continually threatens our livelihood and coexistence as a people. We are also proud of the noble programs of the agency at cushioning the adverse effects of natural disaster, especially floods. These are obvious for all to see. For us in NISA, we have continued to champion the reduction of losses arising from flood disasters in Nigeria through the use of various early warning mechanisms to providing reliable data and information for flood early warning and alerts to relevant and key stakeholders in the disaster risk management, including the National Emergency Management Agency, NEMA, National Orientation Agency, Nigeria Meteorological Agency, and a host of others. Following the release of the 2023 Annual Flood Outlook by the agency in February 2023, the FCT Emergency Management Agency has left no stone unturned to ensuring that the flood information reach the nooks and crannies of the FCT, especially the flood hotspots, that's the highly flood risk areas, and are always on hand to respond to challenges that are being faced by the population that have been affected by floods. I want to once more commend the management and staff of the agency for the good work done, even in the face of daunting challenges. We at NISA are looking forward to build an existing working relationship and collaboration with your agency for the overall growth of the disaster management sector in Nigeria. On a final note, I wish to use this opportunity to appreciate the FCT Emergency Management Agency for their effort in organizing this event. Please, let's join hands together in the prevention and reduction of losses to disaster through our collective efforts to building a resilient future. I thank you all for your attention. Thank you.
Professor Mansour Bako Matazu, the DGCE of NIMET, and then the permanent representative of Nigeria with the World Meteorological Organization, the UN organization, would have loved to be here today. Not just because of his person, but because of the long existing relationship between NIMET and the FEMA. But due to exigencies of duty, he can't make it, and he has directed me to be here today. So we in NIMET, we are mandated to observe, to monitor, and then to provide information, meteorological information, to all Nigerians. And we've been doing that over the years. And in doing that, the United Nations recently launched a program called Early Warning for All, targeting that by 2027, everyone on Earth will have been protected from hazardous weather, water, and climate events. And so, in NIMET, we have been doing that for a very long time, even though 2027 is the target, but we have been involved in the issue of early warning. Madam, in her welcome address, mentioned the issue of early warning for early action. And that is where we belong in the climate services value chain, where you have the producers, you have the enablers, and then you have the users. We in NIMET, the Nigerian Meteorological Agency, we belong to the producer category, and we generate this early warning. However, we have FEMA in the enabler part of the value chain, who have been doing so wonderfully well to take the message from the producer like NIMET, like NISA, and then they translate that into actionable activities by the end users. And so we are happy to be here today to rejoice with them and to congratulate them on the long, over a week activities that has culminated into this today. We are also calling, because from NIMET we do say that weather information is perishable. That means it must be consumed at the right time. And so one thing I want us to take away from this gathering today is that Nigeria has a lot of early warning activities, whether it is coming from NIMET, whether it is coming from NISA, or whether it is coming from the enablers like National Orientation Agency, FEMA, NEMA, and so on. However, down the ladder, we have what is required, and that is called early action. Until we match early warning with early action, that is the time we can actively prevent disasters and ensure that we are able to achieve the theme of this year's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. So I'm calling on all of us, as while we leave this place today, please let us promote early action. Early warning is available. The enablers are working hard. However, we must all be active in doing early action. Thank you so much, and I congratulate everyone.
You are aware that NEMA is promoting disaster risk reduction. And the question is why? The reason is because the cost of disaster risk reduction is far lower than that of response and any other cycle when it comes to disaster management. Going by this year's theme, NEMA is calling all stakeholders to look at Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction, which calls for dedicated action to be focused on tackling underlying disaster risk drivers such as consequences of poverty and inequality. When this is tackled, I think the citizens will have the coping capacity without waiting for anybody to assist them. For this reason, we are saying that it requires all society engagement and partnership. I congratulate FEMA for this day celebration. Thank you.
Today, we gather on the 2023 International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction under the theme, Fighting Inequality for a Resilient Future. This theme resonates deeply with the challenges we face in building a safer and more equitable world for all. Inequality and disaster risks are indivisibly linked. Disaster, whether natural or human-made, does not discriminate. They can strike anyone, anywhere, at any time. However, their impact are not evenly distributed. It is often the most vulnerable and marginalized communities that bear the heaviest burden, exacerbating existing inequalities. As we address disaster risk reduction, we must acknowledge and confront these disparities to create a resilient future. We must fight inequality on multiple fronts. For example, people who live in poverty are more likely to live in areas that are at risk from hazards. They are also less likely to have access to early warning systems and other resources that can help them to stay safe. First, we must invest in building resilience at the community level, ensuring that vulnerable populations have access to the resources, knowledge, and infrastructure needed to withstand and recover from disasters. This means better access to healthcare, education, clean water, and housing. This year's International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction is an opportunity to raise awareness of the link between inequalities and disaster risk. It is also an opportunity to call for action. to reduce inequality and build a more resilient future for all. Second, there are a number of things that we can do to fight inequality and build a more resilient future. This includes investing in early warning systems and ensuring that everyone has access to early warning information. Investing in social safety nets and other programs that support people who are vulnerable to diseases. Promoting gender equality and giving women and girls more authorities. I believe in this case, Director FRM can fully represent both the girls and the women folks. Addressing climate change and other environmental challenges that are increasing disaster risk. In addition to the above, I would also like to add that we need to listen to the voices of people who are most at risk from disasters. They have the knowledge and experience that we need to develop effective solutions. In our case at FEMA, we do conduct various assessments. We conduct vulnerability needs assessment. We conduct impact assessment, risk assessment, even communication assessments, just to respond to this aspect. Thirdly, we must recognize the importance of gender equality in disaster risk reductions. Number 4, we must promote policies and practices that aim to reduce inequality in access to economic opportunities, social services, and participation in decision-making. In an increasingly interconnected world, disparities within and among countries can amplify the impact of disasters. Finally, it is essential to acknowledge that environmental degradation and climate change exacerbate disaster risk. To address this, we must work collectively to reduce carbon emission and transmission to more sustainable practice that benefit everyone rather than just a few. I call on all stakeholders, governmental and non-governmental organizations, local and international bodies, and private individuals to work together to fight inequality for a resilient future. Together, we can create a world where everyone is safe from the impact of disasters.
On the day of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, the speech from the UN Office of Disaster Risk Reduction has summarized all what we are going to talk about, the inequalities, and you will agree with me that it even exists within us here. So it is something that we need to fight. The day is just for celebration. It is a day that we should remind ourselves and then sensitize ourselves that we need to do more things that will reduce the disaster risk in our community, in our society. And of course, we all agree that there are a lot of things that we ought to have been doing, which we are not doing, either as a government or as a person or as a community or community leader. And unless we do that, we will be living with those disasters. It is something that we need to clear away from, and we also need to also get to know that if we rely that there is a natural disaster, then we are running away from the truth that we don't want to do anything, and that gives us push us to an unaccountable situation. So to some of us that belongs to the other school of thought, we do not believe that there is a natural disaster. So whatever that happens must have a reason and it must have a cause. It is not. It is important to know that many disasters are caused by a combination of human factors. For instance, climate change is making some disasters, such as floods and hurricanes, more severe. The climate change when it happens and it made a situation whereby the community is not organized. You build on waterways, you dump refuse indiscriminately, then it is going to be severe. Human activities such as deforestation, development in floodplains can also increase the vulnerability of communities living with disaster. What are the factors influencing community exposure? Our communities are exposed to disaster. So many of them, especially like I said, one of the reasons is the poverty. So, and I try to get these few factors. Location. Communities located in areas that are prone to natural hazards, such as floodplains. I get it, there are natural hazards, but there is no natural disaster. Natural hazards such as floodplains, coastal areas, and seismic zones are more exposed to disasters. And that is why I said, if you build on floodplains, then you are exposing yourself to disaster. So where you are living, the location you are living is a factor that you are living in a disaster-prone area. Built environment. Communities with poorly designed or constructed infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, and buildings, are more exposed to disasters. So any built environment that is contrary to what is expected, like I said, you are expected to build a bungalow, you went and built one floor or a story building, then you are exposed to disaster, you are exposing yourself to disaster. And then where there are no roads or bridges, or the bridges are small, tiny, whereby it cannot be able to contain storm water. So it is going to expose, and by the time it's exploded, it's going to affect those buildings around the area. Population density. Population density, that's why we have more exposures in the satellite towns. The satellite towns are overstretched with the number of people, and then the facilities are also so little, and apart from that, there are no adequate medical facilities, no good roads, no good pipe-borne water. So when there is epidemic or endemic, it is a very good catch for them. You find out that the exposure is there, and then they will easily get exposed, and the population will be affected because they have been at risk. So these are factors that are making a disaster very cheap for the community and for the population. As far as we are concerned, it's also breeding and creating inequality amongst the society. Then vulnerability, I talk about poverty. Poor communities are more vulnerable to disasters as they have fewer resources to cope with the impacts of a disaster.
So every year before the celebration of the International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction, what we do is we make sure we take between 10 days and 14 days to carry out some few activities to mark this International Day for Disaster Risk Reduction. This year, what we did was that we made sure we complete that 14 days sensitization. Why? Because of this year's theme. The theme says, fighting inequality for a resilient future. And the hashtag says, break the cycle. So we had to work together with people at the grassroots, members of the different communities, traditional rulers, religious leaders, and women leaders. We had to carry them along, and that was what we did for the past 10 days till this day. We created awareness, and the key point there was for them to be able to identify the common hazard they have within their environment. If they are able to identify the common hazard they have within their environment, because it is from the hazards that it escalates to a disaster, which leads to loss of lives and properties. For them to be able to prevent, they have to be able to identify it. When they identify the hazard, the common hazards they have around them, they try to prevent it, because we have what we call the avoidable disasters. They should be able to avoid it. And if they cannot avoid it, if they cannot prevent it, they should prepare to mitigate it in order to reduce the impact on residents of that community. So we made sure we did that, and I'm glad to tell you that, honestly speaking, the traditional leaders, our volunteers, the local emergency committee, and all our other stakeholders that we work along with, they were glad that we did it. There were so many chiefdoms that we have not been able to reach to. Within this period, we were able to get down to those chiefdoms, and they welcome us. They were pleased to have us in their midst, and they told us what they have learned, and they will not let us down. So what we have to say now is that we try to encourage them to go back to, in turn, create awareness to members of their wards, members of their families, members of their communities. And that is the essence of celebrating an International Day, to create awareness in order to reduce the impact of disasters, and at the same time to sustain that resilience in future. The inequality aspect of it has to do with the less privileged. Less privileged in what sense? People living with disabilities. There are people living with disabilities. We have the blind people. When a disaster happens, look at your left, look at your right, look at your front, turn to the back and check. Do you have a blind man? Do you have somebody sitting on a wheelchair? Do you have the aged? Do you have somebody bedridden in a house? Try and reach out to them. There are so many people that are very vulnerable that we need a helping hand. And that is where we are talking about breaking the cycle.